Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Shift Happens webinar focusing on sustainability. This is one that I am super excited about. Sustainability is absolutely my passion, and I've been working in this space for a long time, too long to mention, or you'll all be able to guess my age. And today I am happily joined by two experts in the space, Allan Birch, who is the CEO and founder of Tadpole, and Caroline Knowles, who's the Chief Customer Officer at Generate Zero. Both Caroline and Allan are based in New Zealand, and as many of you would know, New Zealand has had the luck to experience mandatory climate disclosures for a few years more than we have here in Australia. So Allan and Caroline are really a wealth of knowledge, both in the sustainability space generally, across strategy and technology, as well as in the mandatory climate disclosure space, which I'm sure all of you are keen to hear about today. So I've only got 30 minutes. I did promise in the marketing there'll be no boring bits. So we will jump straight into it. And I will actually ask Allan and Caroline to introduce themselves. So Caroline, if you just want to give us a brief introduction about Generate Zero, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Claire. And hi, everyone. And thanks for having us, Claire. So, yeah, I'm Caroline Knowles. I'm the Chief Customer Officer at Generate Zero. So Generate Zero is a sustainability platform. So we work with a number of banks, insurers, public sector, and enterprises in New Zealand, helping most of them prepare and report their mandated climate disclosures and measure their inventories and reduce their emissions. So that's kind of all we do. We're working with 7 banks and a number of other organisations. So hand over to you, Allan.
Thanks, guys. Yes, Tadpole, well, we're a Trans-Tasman sustainability, ESG advisory with a lot of experience in the climate space and helping businesses get ready for their climate disclosures. We also help organisations build their broader ESG strategies and plans. I guess one of the things that sets us apart is that we're pretty pragmatic, down to earth and common sense people. So we'll help businesses get from A to B and create value for their business, as opposed to being over technical. And we're a really good mix of people with business acumen that have run organisations and people that have technical know-how. So we're hoping to support Claire and all of you in the Australian market. We're already spending a lot of time in market there, helping businesses get ready with their climate disclosures. So we're off to a racing start.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So I've kind of split the questioning for this webinar. I'm not kind of, I absolutely have split the question in this webinar into 3 sections. The first section is all about getting ready for mandatory disclosures. The second section is about measuring, tracking and reporting emissions. And then the third section is about emission reduction projects. And then we're going to ask at the end Caroline and Allan to give their one piece of advice that they would give to a business getting started on their journey. So first off the bat, to you, Allan, you've helped many companies in New Zealand prepare for mandatory disclosures. What are the most common challenges you see them facing at the very beginning?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch here, Claire, and I think if I had to distill this down to a few, I mean, one of the key ones is they don't start early enough. They haven't built engagement with their board or their exec, and so maybe it's someone in charge of ESG, or maybe it's the CFO, and they've got to deliver this, but they haven't got engagement potentially, and so they just don't start early enough. So that's probably the biggest challenge people face, and they all say, "I wish we'd started sooner." We're lucky in Australia, we're working with people that are getting started early, but there's plenty that haven't even contemplated it. I think when you do start, it's important to get a diverse group of thinkers in the room, because you can't solve this just with a couple of people. You've got to do this climate work in addition to everything else you're doing day to day. So that's one of the reasons you need to start early, because it's going to take you longer than you think. That said, you would have heard a lot of war stories and people saying, that this is horrendous and it's really expensive and takes consumes all of our resources. It doesn't have to feel like that if you start early. I think collaboration across your sector. I think not enough businesses tap into sector organisations. I think Carolyn's going to talk to you about the measuring of your footprint. That's one of the key things to get started on early. It's one of the longest lead time things, and if you don't do that well, it's hard to catch up. Document as you go. The work you do is auditable. So the regulators will come looking for that at some point, and there's a strong audit program that will kick in across all aspects of your disclosure. So documenting as you go. And I think my last piece here is really get comfortable being uncomfortable, right? This is something you haven't done before. Get started early and it won't be as scary as you think it's going to be.
So when you say get started early, if I'm a business, in Australia, as you know, it's a staged rollout, cohort 1, 2, and 3. And if I'm in, the third cohort and it's really not going to be till 2027, 28 that I'm going to have to worry about this, do I actually need to get started now?
I think that the very first thing you need to do if you're in group 3 is understand what's in front of you. Get your board and exec understanding that typically, and if you're in group 1, obviously it's right now, and many businesses' financial year starts on the 1st of July, so they'll be starting to think about it. Those that started on the 1st of Jan are almost getting close to the finish line. We're working with a couple of clients in group 2 who are saying we want to do a dry run. If you're in group 3, then start thinking about resourcing, budgeting, and building awareness across the business. I think is probably the key thing. If it's that far out, doing nothing this far out is probably not a great idea. But you don't have to do the whole. I wouldn't do the whole disclosure just yet.
Yeah, no, good advice. And I think we've spoken together, Allan, to a lot of businesses who are already thinking about scope 1 and 2 emissions, but certainly the most common question, and also ahead of this webinar when I asked people to nominate questions, is they asked about scope 3. So, and thinking, in particular businesses listening to this webinar are in the supply chain space. How well do supply chain businesses typically understand their scope 3 emissions, and what do they need to watch out for?
Most of them don't understand it that well, to be fair, Claire. They might have, many businesses have got a grip on scope 1 and 2 and they've put off scope 3, or they might have measured a little bit of freight, a bit of waste, a bit of travel, but most haven't thought about their goods, purchased goods and services. So I think generally they don't understand it very well. A lot of the time their suppliers don't have the data, so you need to start this collaborative kind of process. And scope 3 is complex. You are depending on other people, other partners, and can be scary. But it is really doable. I've heard people say, "Oh, it's too hard." It's not. If you lean into it and you've been doing some spend-based thinking, and then you move to activity-based, I think with a good plan, I think it comes back to when you're if you haven't been doing anything, what's the first thing that you would do? And for us, we would say to any business, doesn't matter what group they're in, think about doing a readiness assessment or a gap analysis, and businesses can do those themselves in-house. That's all very well, but partnering with someone externally just brings that extra level of sort of commitment from the company and ability to lock in engagement from the board and the executive. And one of the key things that comes out of that readiness is a bit of an assessment of where you're at with scope 3. So it's scary, it is complex, but it's very doable if you get started early enough.
And I love that point about data, and that really creates a great segue for me into speaking to Caroline, because Generate Zero is, of course, a data and technology business. So Caroline, from your perspective on that technology side, what kind of data or internal processes do need to be in place to support this whole proper disclosure process?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, yeah, and compared to sort of not disclosing, with the mandated disclosures, you need very robust technology, data, internal processes to measure and manage and audit your emissions. So the old spreadsheets you might have used before really don't cut it particularly for audit purposes. So you really need to kind of be engaging with a partner and talking about a platform potentially to measure your emissions. The data piece is really critical. So you need accurate and reliable data for that underlying measurement piece. So you can't manage what you can't measure, as the old saying goes. So getting that kind of measurement baseline is really critical. And then engaging kind of with your suppliers as well. As Allan mentioned, your scope 1, 2 and 3 supplier data is going to be really critical. So sort of starting to talk to them and identify who they are really from the start is really important. And then also bringing in a control framework is key as well. So documenting everything, documenting your measurement approach, your data sources, your inputs and assumptions, and kind of keeping that all documented is really key. And that also provides transparency through that audit process, which is very important. So those internal processes are really key. And engaging the broader teams as well, so your finance teams, your sustainability people, and then also your IT people.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from both of you out of this first section about getting ready for the mandatory disclosure process is to engage as many people across the business as early as possible, from board level, and from also across sector, across the business. I'm really hearing that loud and clear from both of you in this first section. And then if we move into sort of focusing on the second section I want to talk about, which is measuring, tracking and reporting emissions. And I just want to unpack also the role of tech in that, Caroline, and you made a comment around spreadsheets not cutting it when you kind of get to this stage. Think about a business that maybe today has literally not started measuring and tracking emissions. It's never done it before. How should they get started?
Yeah, well, you really need to start with the basics, so materiality assessment to work out which emission sources are material for you, looking at your organisational boundaries in your base year and just kind of working out what you need to start measuring and reporting on is really key at the start. Then you need to build reliability and repeatability into your processes of collecting that data, and automation as well. So you don't want to be stuck manually entering data into spreadsheets each month. You want to then, work out how you're going to get that data into potentially a platform, automate that, and work with a partner to do that reporting, because it's going to be a whole lot easier. And as your data builds up and you get more and more data, managing it in spreadsheets is going to become more and more cumbersome. So, but it's really key at the start to just get started, as Allan said, and then identify any data gaps. And as I mentioned before, looking at scope 3 is really important, even though it's not part of that year 1 disclosures. For most of the organisations we work with, probably just about all of them, scope 3 is often over 80% of their emissions. For some of the banks, it's like 99% of their emissions. So a lot of the emissions will be in that scope 3, particularly the purchase goods and services supply chain area, and then financed emissions for banks, and some of the government agencies. A lot of it's in travel, so a lot of the emissions will be in that scope 3 area. So it's good to get started on that one as early as possible.
And both you and Allan have said this is a complex process. I don't think any of us are pretending this is not a complex, difficult process. So, and it's really data heavy. Like Allan said, probably 3 times, data. You're saying data. So how can technology be used to help simplify this complex, data heavy process?
So we've seen it all, kind of working with some of the clients here in New Zealand. I've seen a spreadsheet that had 80 tabs, and had about 8 years of data on it, and it was so heavy that you couldn't even open it. And that's kind of what happens if you do keep building the data up and you don't use the technology. What the technology allows you to do is really automate that input of the data, allows you to visualize the data, share the emission sources, so you can bring many more people within the organisation on the journey with you. Also kind of create your reduction plans and your reduction forecasts, which might be, part of year 2 or year 3, but that's really how you're going to kind of move the dial and move towards net zero. And the technology will really support that. If you try and do reduction planning in a spreadsheet, it's not pretty. You'll just end up with lots and lots of graphs and scenarios that you can't share. So really important to kind of get a tool that has that as well. And then also the management of emission factors is really key, and having that managed through a platform is really important because they change every year and there's a lot of different sources and things, and so the automation of that is really key.
Yeah. And I know there's a lot of different carbon tracking and carbon accounting tools out there. Some businesses I speak to are using tools from overseas that are pushed onto them by their head office in other markets. Can you just tell me sort of quickly around what companies should be aware of when they're choosing the carbon tracking or carbon accounting tool that works for them?
Yeah, I mean, I would say number one thing is automation. So that automation of the data ingestion, the ability to ingest data through APIs and pre-map files and all of those things, because as we know, emissions data is very fragmented and it's quite difficult to ingest. So a platform that does that for you well. The UX and the UI is really important. So the ability to visualize the data, drill down, kind of see the data in lots of different ways. And make it really easy for people to use it so people can come in and use the platform kind of from day one. Thinking about future functionality is really key too. So you're not just thinking about what you need for today, but also tomorrow. So reduction planning is important. The ability to audit from within the platform is also key. So auditors can go in and be able to trace the data through and do their audit from within the platform. And then also data sets and databases that support the platform and support supply chain measurement as well. So the Generate Zero platform has a large database of all the businesses who have disclosed, and what that does is provide supplier specific emission factors to support purchase goods and services measurement, which is much more accurate than just using a spend-based high-level methodology. So kind of data that also supports the measurement within the platform is also really important.
Yeah, absolutely. That's game changing for accuracy, isn't it? Allan, I can see you nodding along here. I assume you're the recipient of a lot of this data that comes out of various platforms and spreadsheets. How do you, in your role, ensure that emissions data is credible, auditable, and it's aligned with reporting standards?
Yeah, well, there's obviously a couple of standards that businesses need to comply with, so it's not really a DIY exercise. And Carolyn's example of people struggling with data is something that we see that's very real. It's that cooperation across supply chain is super critical. So if we're getting a lot of data coming into us and we're helping people build their strategies and put their disclosures together, we want to understand, what due diligence have they done on the data, where has it come from, so we can trust that data and building the disclosure. And a key part of an organisation's transition plan is building in the decarbonisation pathway, along with understanding how do their risks and opportunities integrate with the rest of their business strategy. So it's a key piece that it underpins, it creates a foundation for the entire transition plan as companies over following years really properly integrate this into their business strategy. So bad data in can lead to poor decisions down the line. It's a pretty important step.
And are there any misconceptions you see from companies about what good reporting looks like?
Yeah, that's a great question actually, because in our first year in Australia, people are going to be saying, well, what does good look like? How do I know I've done enough? I recall the first year in New Zealand where we saw reports from sort of 6 pages to 140 pages long, and you go, well, 140 is probably a bit too many, but 6 is probably not quite enough. I think that the trick with a good disclosure is obviously you've got to meet in year one. You're focused on meeting the requirements of the standard. You're understanding it and you're meeting the requirements of it. Ultimately, you want this disclosure as a snapshot of a point in time about climate and climate risk and climate change and how it's impacting your business. So you want to build this in a way that creates value to your organisation, but it's also readable. I don't know how many of you online have tried to read a climate disclosure. You'll know what a good one looks like the minute you start reading it, because you are engaged. Whereas some of the others are a bit like walking through wet concrete, and they're pretty hard going. So I think they're not marketing pieces. The regulators would be very clear to tell us that they're disclosures, but you also do need to make them interesting to read. There's a way to make complex technical information interesting to read if you put the work into it.
A few lawyers could be told about that, couldn't they?
That
is important.
Well, they do have their place, right? You do need to make sure you meet the requirements, but yeah, you do need to be pragmatic and practical along the way.
Yeah, but I totally agree. And I mean, the goal of this legislation as well is to engage the market in sustainability and make sure that companies across Australia and New Zealand understand what they can do for sustainability. And we want this to be inclusive. It is a technical, complex process, but we need to get everyone across the business involved. So if your disclosures can be readable and understandable across the business and the broader community around your business, that's very, very important.
Yeah.
So I'm keen to move on to the third sort of section. So we've had a bit of a discussion about getting ready for mandatory disclosures. We've talked about tracking and reporting emissions and that data piece. And so then imagine in a perfect world, you've got ready for your mandatory disclosures, you're reporting and tracking, and the goal of everything is to reduce our emissions. So I just want to touch a bit on in this final section, how do we think about embarking on emission reduction projects? So we move from a compliance focus to an impact focus, which is what, why we're all getting out of bed to do this for. So what can businesses do beyond the report? Allan, I would ask you this first one. Once a business has the visibility over its emissions, where should it first look for reduction opportunities?
I think you've got to look where it's material. I think that's one of the things Carolyn talked about, doing a materiality assessment right back at the beginning. I think you have to focus on the stuff that's material. There's no point in spending money on reducing waste if you're an office-based business, for example, or professional services. You're going to get accused of greenwashing pretty quickly. So do the things that are material. It takes time. So your target is going to be over a long period of time. Your target, your internal target in year one might be to really learn more about this. But engaging your supply chain partners is going to be the secret to unlocking progress here. I was in Melbourne a couple of weeks ago with a client, and they were telling me that they're going to get about a 31% reduction in their emissions over the next 5 to 10 years by partnering with suppliers that have science-based targets. So they've chosen their partners very carefully, and as those companies execute and deliver on their plans, let's assume they do, then they will benefit from that. So businesses are actually starting to think about that, and it's enabling them much faster progress, strong collaboration than it would be trying to do it on your own. So focus, I think, on the stuff that's material. We always think about other than materiality, what can you have an impact on? How much collaboration is there? If you're importing stuff from overseas, and sometimes the data is hard to get from third parties, so you've got to start early and progress. You'll get better over time.
And Caroline, do you see particular areas of the supply chain where tech is able to play a big role in emission reduction?
Yes, absolutely. And as we've said, the supply chain is often, one of the most challenging parts of an organisation's inventory to measure and also influence. So we've got clients with suppliers, or more than sort of 2,000 or 3,000 suppliers. So then it becomes a mammoth task just to measure the emissions of those, let alone, work on how to reduce those emissions. So we we help them with a hybrid approach within our platform, which means kind of looking at the most material suppliers, and we recommend engaging directly with those ones because that's where a lot of the emission sources are, and working directly to measure and then also look at reducing the emissions of those. We then use our supplier database for the kind of as many of the rest of them as possible. And the reason that's really important is that you'll have a supplier specific emission factor then too, and can also look at what those reductions of those suppliers data is as well, because that's also in the database. And then the third way is to take that spend-based emission factor approach, which if you just looked at spend-based factors, the danger of that is the only way to reduce your supplier emissions is to cut back on spend. So, which is, a bit dangerous because there's a lot of other ways and it just doesn't take in, the actual suppliers' activities and what they're doing. So that's what our platform does. And the really key part of is when you have 2,000 or 3,000 suppliers is the automation of that measurement, because it is a lot of work to do that manually. So that's where the platform really helps.
Absolutely. You don't want to be managing that on a spreadsheet that is just like probably saved on a single person's device.
Yeah.
We've all seen it. And so, Allan, then, do you have examples from New Zealand where supply chain led initiatives have created real carbon reductions?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've in areas like in transport and freight, analysing the freight supply platforms that you've got, the different modes of transport, and interacting with customers around this delivery. That there's definitely tangible programs that you can put into place there. Working sourcing, look when stuff's imported, looking at the sourcing country and understanding the location, because that has quite a bearing on emissions. It sounds simple, but sometimes you can source more locally, which can have a material impact. I appreciate that cost and product performance isn't always the same, but there's certainly a number of areas where businesses can make meaningful difference. But one of the areas that they tend to focus on early is especially if you're thinking about scope 3 is in freight. If you're thinking about I guess other aspects, there's a lot of work going on in scope 2 with engaging with external partners to assess energy efficiency, and so there's a lot of potential there for innovation and engaging supply chain partners to look at new forms of energy. So I think there's low hanging fruit there as well.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. And we are almost up to our final question. I guess I'll just sort of do a wrap up of what I've heard from you so far before you answer the final question. And I'm hearing, key points, takeaways from our audience are very much about engaging people early, cross-functionally, and at high level, ideally board level. So that's come out loud and clear from both of you in terms of the getting started. And then in the reporting piece, the data and integrity of your data and its ability to be auditable, and also setting up a scalable process, ideally using technology. That was my real key takeout, that technology and that automation, especially as you get to the bigger end, being able to automate the ingestion of that data is really important. And then I think from this final section around reducing emissions, it's focus on what you can control and what's material to your business, and working with a partner ideally who has done it before. So in a final wrap-up question, I would just, love for you to tell me if there was one piece of advice for Australian supply chain leaders, many of whom are on this call now, about sustainability and compliance. What would that piece of advice be? Caroline, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, well, I actually reached out to our customers and asked them this so we could bring their feedback back to the webinar. And one of the things that came through quite loud and clear was to be mindful that it's a 5-year process at least to build the organisation's maturity in this area. So you need to manage internal and external messaging to make sure this is acknowledged and understood, and it's not going to sort of happen overnight. And if I'm allowed to, the other one was to put time and effort into building the climate knowledge of your exec team and board, because that will make other parts of the process so much easier. And I know Allan said that at the start too.
Yeah, fantastic. They're both great. Allan?
Yeah, I think, Karen, that's spot on. I think everybody's learning as they go here, right? You guys haven't done this before. You can look at other places to get inspiration, but the reality is this will be your first time. You've got to do it, your own disclosure. You can't copy somebody else's. So, I just reiterate what Carolyn said. Get the board engaged very early. Bring them in. Get the exec engaged. Then you're not doing this on your own. Because the sooner you get everybody else engaged, the better. And just accept that you don't know everything, and that you'll learn a lot pretty quickly. Yeah, this is a forever thing. You're not doing a 1 year thing. This is going to be in the business now forever. So you don't have to solve every problem in the first year.
Absolutely, it's not one and done. We appreciate everyone staying until the end to listen to us. Thank you. And thank you so much, Allan and Caroline, for being involved. If anyone would like to contact Allan or Caroline, please reach out to me or contact them directly. I'm sure they'd love a LinkedIn connection from you. And a little plug from me for the next webinar in our series, which is focused on robotics and automation. We have our awesome partner, Atabotics, and we have the CEO, Scott Crabell, from Canada on the next session, and that is on Tuesday, the 24th of June. So please follow Extolla's LinkedIn and sign up to our newsletter, and we will send out registration details for that webinar very soon. Thank you so much again, Allan and Caroline. Thank you, everyone, for staying on. I know we've gone 2 minutes over, but I hope you've all enjoyed the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire.
Great. Thanks, Claire.